So good video yesterday where somebody was shouting at developers, and that's a favorite of mine because I usually want to shout at developers. So having somebody else do it is nice. So it's this video, and to give a little bit of context. Is about Stop Killing Games, which I know a little bit about. I saw the original petition, I think it was, and it's about holding developers accountable in a way where if they sell a game that requires online-only functionality, then there should be some plan for the end of life of the software, because people have paid for it, and maybe there could be some kind of community stewardship for maintaining that game. And apparently that was a contentious issue, and that ended up with this discussion, or not discussion, Destiny talking about pirate software. And I have some familiarity with Destiny streams. I just vaguely know about pirate software. I made this meme opener for this. So Destiny, he will say that in the video, but he knows about development but is not a developer. So he says he doesn't know anything. Pirate software has worked in game development, which he suspiciously drops a lot. So, oh yeah, and they're also both prolific Inkscape users. I don't have that skill. I just do stuff in Inkscape, and yeah. So I just wanted to go through a portion of that video and maybe provide some color. Also, being a developer, although I have to bracket that, because I'm not a game developer. I know a few game developers and I follow them and I look at their work. But as a web developer, in the hierarchy of how professional you are, I mean, web developers are kind of like the bottom rung, so that's where I am. And I even develop in PHP, so that means I'm basically, I think PHP usually ranks below JavaScript developers, so that's kind of where I am. And I've the biggest credential that I have is that I've done this now for about 16 years. So I do kind of know my way around, and I've done it long enough to, how can you put that? I've seen the edges and the fractures, and I know what I don't want to do, and I've seen a lot of the complexity that people, or the complexity traps that people fall into. So that's kind of the perspective that I want to bring to this, because in a lot of ways, even though Destiny doesn't know particulars, I think his pattern matching is kind of correct. And so I want to put some foundation on that. So this is mostly Destiny fighting with developers in his chat, and again, somebody screaming at developers is always welcome. So let's see.
Software as a service dependencies seem like one of the biggest issues. If my game server depends on a service by another company running on their servers, how does that continue past the game's lifetime with no one paying that other company? Well, you know what? I bet somehow in the code you can put an or thing, and then type in null for no value if that other service is down. What other internet service are you relying on that would make your server completely and totally broken if you weren't able to query some other service created by a whole other different company? Give me an example of what we would be talking about.
And they're going to be a bunch of examples that are quite good. I think the core of this issue is that he's rightly addressing that mostly software developers do not think about robustness that much. they rely on services as they rely on APIs and they rely on libraries, and we just kind of assume that everything will work out, and we don't have a good plan for what happens if that isn't the case. And a service can be down, a service can change, libraries can change, and there is a trap that you can fall into where mostly you just deal with these kind of dependencies, and that's a bad.
Here could be a database. What are all these? What are all these proprietary database deployment methods that are completely like proprietary, that are totally inaccessible to anybody else? Nobody has cracked how to do a database besides some other company that, man, I don't believe it. I just don't believe it. I don't think these are real problems. You sound like a lazy dev who knows words, who are trying to say, well, you can't do a thing because you're lazy. I don't believe you. I don't believe.
The theme is quite right. So there is a culture of people who are really into talking about how complicated things are, and in most cases it's I'm trying to be a little more balanced here, but in most cases it's usually about people trying to make their job sound very complicated, when it's in most situations it's entirely in their hands how complicated their job is. And if they have unsolvable problems and some weird issues that they can't get past, the thing that they should be asking themselves is how do I always end up in this situation? But that usually doesn't happen.
Believe it. Maybe Flight Simulator that uses real-time weather data. That's a good example, okay? So if it pings something like, my guess is going to be there's a lot of public servers like Google or whatever, but this would be a thing, and I think that the company, and I think everybody would agree that they would be fine with this, right? Is that if you had a flight simulator game and say that it pinged Google, whatever bullshit, you would have a thing where if it tries to ping that server, or if it tries to query that server for information, if it can't get it, then it would just say, oh, this is unavailable. And then at the very least, well, fine, then you can't get mad at the developer. Now it's up to them to maintain that. And maybe Google makes a license or whatever where you can pay to have access to it from your machine or your IP so that you can query from your game. There are a billion different ways you can solve all of these problems. I know that there are, okay? It's not 1874 and our computers are a bunch of women that we've locked in basements to do math problems for us. Okay, there's a billion different ways that you can, I'm sure, that you could figure this out.
Politicians generally don't care about video games, so this isn't of big consequence to them or most of their constituencies.
I'm going to stop it there for a moment. The assertion that politicians just like easy wins, so this legislation will go through, but the politicians don't care about a multi-billion-dollar global industry and that it doesn't matter to their constituencies is incredibly absurd to me. I don't think this is the right direction at all for a movement like this. I think it's incredibly damaging and it makes our entire industry look bad.
I'm not trying to get into the content of Stop Killing Games, but just a side note on this. If highlighting an industry practice like this makes the industry look bad, then surely the industry has a role in all this. And if the software industry would do more to not always look bad in terms of performance, in terms of quality, then maybe they would have a different approach here available. But as it stands, most of the stuff that you get from the software industry and from game development is mostly built on sand. And if small things like this can break stuff, then it's bad. And if a petition like this can make your entire industry look bad, then maybe there is something where you should investigate why it is so easy to make you look bad.
Both on the player side and the developer side. If we're going to...
What is even the thing Pirate Software is complaining about? Okay, here's this issue, okay? Quick reminder, okay, that if you're joining chat and you think I'm like a software developer, I don't know anything about programming, okay? So I get incredibly passionate about things I have no understanding of. Only when it comes to this, because I like triggering all my engineers in chat. Here's the issue that's happening. And then I'll tell you where Pirate Software is on this, because this is the perfect 115 IQ, okay, high mid-wit trap to fall into. Here's the issue, okay? This isn't just true in software development, okay? This is true in all things in life.
So he sets up a graph between perceived difficulty and actual difficulty, and heroin is pretty it's perceived to be simple, and it is simple. It's very easy to get addicted to heroin. Olympic athlete is kind of hard to do. You have to put in a lot of effort to do that. I'm not sure how good this example is, like high G.
Contract their muscles to stay. Back when I used to watch videos of people doing high G maneuvers, they have to do a whole bunch of weird they have to like kick their legs, and they gotta like take weird breaths, and they gotta contract their muscles to stay like conscious or whatever. There's like a lot of work that goes into it. It seems like, oh, I guess, I don't know, you just like don't pass out like a, but there's actually a lot of work. And then there's stuff that seems really, really, really difficult, but it's actually incredibly easy. I would say literally all forms of, I think there's a lot of art stuff that fits here. So like for music, if you're a good musician, sometimes people can hear a song and play it, and it's like, oh my God, that's crazy difficult. But if you're trained, it's like, well, no, that's actually just very, very, very easy. Although I'm qualifying that a little bit with the training. Okay. Here's the issue with software people. Okay. Now, rightfully, okay, sometimes you might have a program and a manager or a CEO, some guy might come up to you and say like, hey, can we add this thing? Should be super easy to do, right? And it might seem like a really easy thing to do, but it's actually an unbelievably difficult thing to change. It would actually be crazy. Let's say that we had like Twitter that existed, but there were like no DMs, there were no private messages, right? So it's like, oh, can we just add DMs so we can private message people, right? Well, they can tweet. We should be able to DM each other, right? But like the stuff that you would need to send private messages between accounts, well, it seems like, well, if you can tweet, you can just send a private message, right? But that's like a whole different process. It's a whole different thing. So that might seem like an easy thing to do, but it's probably, there's a lot of work that goes into that.
Although it usually is easier if you already have infrastructure in place. So extending an application with direct messages when the application is already kind of about messages is not as hard as building the messages from the ground up. So that's why the assumption that this should be easy, I don't think it's like that hard in this case. I've actually, to take this over, I had a different example that I heard in the industry where people were developing like a browser 2D game, and once they were done, some project manager came in here and said, well, and now we just need to make it 3D. Well, that is an entirely different, because everything, all the assets that you have made and all the way that you structured that system was reliant on everything being 2D, and adding a third dimension, that's pretty hard.
The problem is that like loser programmers are so used to hearing stuff like this. Sometimes they start to pretend that every single thing is like this. These people in chat, by the way, these are all the people that are going to be crying in 5 years that AI stole their jobs. You
True.
ask them for anything, and they'll be like, oh, that's actually way harder than you think. Actually, there's a dependency there, and there's actually nothing because it's depending on something else. And it's like, you can't like write an API so anything could like act. Actually, no, because I don't do that. It's actually way harder. You don't understand. It's because you have to like do a whole bunch. It's actually really hard to do all of this stuff because it's like never been. It's like, and they'll give you an excuse for everything. Okay, these are losers who they will make an excuse and they'll say everything's hard. It's not true. Okay, some stuff is hard, but not everything is hard. It's 2025. Okay, there's a ton of cool shit you can do today with software and programs and platforms and Docker and Wine and Linux and.
I go back to that, but the classic sketch from that is this one.
I'm still not understanding this. Why is it so hard to display the birthday date on the settings page? Why can't we get this done this quarter?
Look, I'm sorry, we've been over this. It's the design of our back end. First, we have to call the bingo circus. See,
It's the design of our backend. It's so correct. I mean, people start out with, this is our design, and they don't listen to themselves.
Bingo knows everyone's name-o, so we get the user's ID out of there. Then from Bingo, we can call Papaya and MBS to get that user ID and turn it into a user session token. We can validate those with Omnop, And then, once we have that, we can finally pull the user's info down from Raccoon.
Yeah, but couldn't the Raccoon team basically just...
No, Raccoon isn't guaranteed to have that info. Before we do this, we have to go to Wingman, do a query to see if the user's willing to take it to the next level, or if they're just playing the field. Now, Wingman is cool, but he doesn't store any user info himself. He has to reach out to other user info provider services, like RGS, Barbie Doll, Ringo 2, BLS. But how does it know what all the user provider services are? Well, for that, it has to go to Galactus, an all-knowing user service provider aggregator. And while Galactus has omniscient knowledge of all current user info providers, it doesn't have future sight or knowledge of past user info providers, so it expects a time range. To get all the current user info providers, we need to pass a time range with the current time and a time representing the end of the universe, which we get from EKS, our entropy chaos service. EKS is being deprecated at the end of the month for Omegastar, but Omegastar still doesn't support ISO timestamps like they said they would a month ago, so until Omegastar gets their fucking shit together, we're blocked. We can't get signed up for our use case, we can't use EKS, there's nothing we can do. So Galactus won't be able to find our new birthday boy provider, which means Wingman won't know how to talk to anybody, which means I won't be able to find true love and I'll die alone.
And you think, wait, can't we just convert the ISO timestamps? Isn't that a thing we can do? But there is like a deeper point in this, and that comes back to Conway's law, basically. And there is a very, very, very good talk about this. Conway's law is the law that says that software projects in their lifetime at some point start to resemble the organizational structure that the company uses to bring about that software. And Casey Morituri did a very good talk on the only unbreakable law. You can watch on his Molly Rocket channel. And the gist of it is that to do anything more complicated than a simple thing, at some point you have to get more people involved. And as it grows, the more people you add, the more friction you add, because every new developer that you add in has to know about the system, has to be told what to do. It's the basis for for this book, The Mythical Man Month. There's and the short version is that a pregnancy takes 9 months, no matter how many women you assign to the task. But the basic idea is that if a project is late in its development cycle, every new developer that you add onto that job will increase the amount of time you need, because bringing them into the fold is a task in and of itself.
And here begins the very crucial and what I think are profound insights from this paper. Melvin Conway then tells us, once you have chosen some aspects of the design and you decide to delegate duties to it, right? Like you create an org chart or something, this team's going to do something, and maybe that team actually needs sub-teams to coordinate, right? Once you start having a structure, an actual human structure to the design, every time you make a new piece, a new breakdown of that organization, you are presupposing that certain designs are not necessary. You may not be doing this knowingly, but just the act of drawing a dividing line between two teams means that you're saying that the design of the thing you're making doesn't really need to have a high bandwidth communication on between those two areas, right? Like the tires of the car and the engine of the car are going to be designed by different teams, so we're presupposing that the engine and the tire cannot be one piece, right? And sometimes that's a perfectly reasonable thing, but other times it may be lopping off parts of the design space that actually were where the best thing was, right?
So the more you vertically integrate development, the more you are able to get all the wins that are possible, and the more you split it up, the more you presuppose what these edges and these corners are in the whole system. And people usually do not do this wittingly. They really do this out of necessity, because you might have people who are experts in parts of this system, parts of another system. And it's very rare that you get developers who know the whole system, which is unfortunately also a function of how complicated we make things. And we do this a lot, actually. And there is a lot of stuff in the perceived difficulty area where we just pile on a lot of things that are not fundamental to understanding the issue. All the industry standard patterns that you have, they usually serve to sound very, well, it's industry standard, so it sounds like it's some kind of authority, and everybody does it like that. Like object-oriented programming is a good example of that, or the new iteration of that, which is microservices, where everything has to be, well, as it is in this picture, everything has to be split up. But now you've entered API layers everywhere, and that usually makes the things very slow. Yeah.
All cool computer stuff, okay? But sometimes for developers, whenever you ask them to do anything, all right, their brains shut down, and they're like, actually, you're basically asking me to reverse engineer how they built the pyramids. I don't know where Stonehenge came from. And that's what my modern 2025 application that I built in React is. Okay.
And it really is this. Like people build systems like this, and to a certain extent, they do this because they like to be in charge of something very complicated, and they don't really care that much about making it any simpler. Because that is not job security. It's very. If you are the expert that understands this, then your job is pretty safe. And the idea of all these industry standard patterns and so forth is that it makes developers interchangeable, but developers have found a way around that, and they just make things more complicated all the time. So, well.
Okay, it's indecipherable. There's no way to change any part of it whatsoever, and to do so would require 20,000 man-hours of a A+ dev team pulled from both AWS and Google, and it's like, get the out of here. So every time somebody says something like, hey, couldn't you like keep a game online afterwards? They come up with all these like, well, actually it's hard because the server, it can't be hosted on Windows. And it's like, okay, I'm pretty sure even Windows probably has like VMs for other environments or whatever, right? It's like, and when I say VMs, okay, stuff used to be hard on computers, right? Like if I wanted to do something, I would have to start Googling all sorts of instructions on, but now it's probably really easy. My guess is I could probably get like Linux fully running on some whatever bullshit distro by watching a YouTube video and like double clicking the right things. All right. It used to be really hard. You used to have to do a lot of, but everything today is built for cards and by cards. All right. So this idea that it would be impossible to deploy a server locally, or that would be impossible because actually this was made before something, and it's like, okay, is there like a config file where you can change true to false and it would fix that whole problem? Well, or like, actually this is it relies on like another service or whatever. Can it be bundled with it? No. Can you just turn it off? Maybe. Could you write an API to let somebody else plug into it? Well, that would actually require so much work. Is there already an API written for it, but it's just like hard-coded to use the other thing? Could you just like not do that? Well, and that's why AI is going to eat all of their jobs, okay?
That is kind of true. The deeper point here is that we are in an internal battle against complexity. And there's another good talk by Casey Muratori about the 30 million line problem. This is a graph of the Linux code base, which is approaching, or it probably has passed 20 million lines now. I'll play a little bit of this to give you an idea.
Out the text, you know? And so we have to think about why, if it should be so much easier to make software today, why is it actually seem to oftentimes not get any better? Although we do add features over time, certainly, The experience doesn't seem to get much better, and also all of these other aspects of the experience that are horrible all of a sudden start coming in. Why are there all these long load times and spinning progress bars that never seem to complete and crashes and all these other things? Why are all of these things
It's
seeming
much
to
worse in
be
web
more
development too.
rampant rather than less when we should be having an easier time, right, with making the software, and more of our focus, it should be easy to have more of our focus spent on reliability and all this sort of stuff, because we're doing fundamentally, hopefully, less work to make a reasonably performant experience for the end user. That's
And it even has like a web request as an example here.
machine. How many lines of code would it take to read a text file? Right? All I want to do is I want to read in a text file. That's an operation that we might do today, right? And if you think about the way that a modern person reads a text file, they're in a web browser, and the web browser goes to a URL, it downloads a text file, and displays it onto the screen. How many lines of code must be functioning properly and performantly in order for that experience to work reliably and well? The answer is, I don't know, but it's not less than 56 million.
And it's growing.
I'm not kidding. This is basically what it looks like, right? I picked a random possible way that a website might commonly work, such as a LAMP stack, right, running WordPress. But you could substitute those out with anything else you wanted. They are not particularly high contributors, right?
So the basic idea here is that usually we want this. We have a browser and we want data. And to get the data, we need to connect to a web server. And even this simple thing includes at least 50 million lines of code. Even leaving out like the WordPress and the database and all that stuff. Even if it was just a static file, we would still be at about 50 million because you can leave all this out. But basically everything here.
All of you guys, we're back to this. I don't care. All right.
$1 global industry, and that it doesn't matter the constituencies is incredibly absurd to me. I don't think this is the right direction at all for a movement like this. I think it's incredibly damaging, and it makes our entire industry look bad, both on the player side and the developer side. If we're going to be putting forward...
Again, making the industry look bad. Do we have a hand in this in some capacity?
anything that may eventually turn to legislation, it should be passing because it's the right thing to do for consumers and developers, and that there's some kind of a middle ground, not just because it's an easy win and politicians don't care.
And before that, there was a long section about where he also talked about how hard it would be to self-host a server. And isn't he kind of rightly said, it shouldn't that be simple? And that's true, but then sometimes the web server or the game server is this setup. And that might actually be hard to replicate or to self-host.
Sets us off on a completely wrong foot.
EU law is already unclear on a lot of this practice anyway.
And that's dangerous. If we're going to be setting precedent, which could change the way that law works all the way down the road, then we need to be sending the right message, which this is sending a vague message that doesn't cover the actual problem. So this is not a win to me. This is a huge risk.
And we would be
Actual question, what is your guess in terms of cost that it would take to replace a game engine like UE5 to a custom-made engine? How many companies would do this? The cost for that, to replace Unreal Engine 5 with a fully custom engine, my guess is $50 billion. But when people make custom engines, a custom engine is like 98% the same underlying with like 2% changed. And people will say, this is my custom implementation of this, is my custom thing. When people are making custom engines, they're not rebuilding every single part. I don't know if you would call it the stack or whatever. They're not redoing how like pixels are rendered on the ground. They're not like redesigning from the ground up, like everything. Here's my guess. I don't know. Well, my guess is UE5 is probably like 70% of the code of like UE4, which is probably like 70% of the code of like UE.
Yes and no. People actually do build their own game engines, and they might even go as far as all the way down the stack to drawing pixels on the screen. That actually happens. And it often is actually a good idea to do that, because the subset of UE5 that you need for your game might be extremely slim. And building your own game engine might unlock stuff that otherwise would be hard in a huge engine. An engine just solves all the problems kind of in the same way. But when you have something that doesn't quite fit, it's the old framework thing where 80% of the work is suddenly extremely simple and the other 20% is basically impossible. And people sometimes fall into this trap where they use a framework or use a game engine and they get to 80% done, and then suddenly they just run into problem after problem because it doesn't quite do what they want. But it's also true that UE5 is built on UE4 and UE3 all the way back to the first Unreal and Unreal Tournament. And there's probably still code in there that, I think it made that point too, there's still code in there that dates way, way back, because some things really do not change. But there is a huge pile of optimizations, and, well, it's kind of the Conway's Law thing again, where a game engine also has a role to play in how easy it is for your team to develop something. So that also might be hard to recreate.
My guess is if you would have dragged some old mother out of their grave and have them look at UE5, some guy would be like, holy I remember writing that in call when I was designing Quake 1, okay, is maybe there now sometimes there are like huge redesigns.
I think there's even Quake code in the latest Half-Life source engine still running, so
designs that involve a significant change, but like most like custom stuff is not rebuilt completely from the ground up. And even when people say built from the ground up, it doesn't mean they're redesigning every single subcomponent of a thing.
Again, partially true. You wouldn't recreate the operating system, although there are actually people who want to have a operating system level binary that you can execute, that you can boot into, so you wouldn't need part of this, basically.
Okay, I don't even know what I'm screaming at. I don't even care that much.
Be making it easy for them to settle it. It falls in line with other consumer practices. You know how when you buy something, you're generally allowed to keep it?
In the case of live service games, in the terms of service for those, you are not buying the game. You're buying a license to the game. And that's the part that's really different here. If we don't like the idea of live service games as a whole, I get it. Don't play live service games then. Don't agree to those terms. But if we're into this weird idea...
But when everybody starts making live service games, also this like you buy a license and not the game, is who cares? Then just change the license then. Like that's all people are asking, no?
That we need to get rid of all live service games or damage that practice in any way to keep in line with consumer policies. It is in line with consumer policies. If it wasn't, it wouldn't be there in the first place. So this doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. You're not buying the game, you're buying a license to the game. In the niche cases where a studio is trying to sell a game as if you are buying it or purchasing it or using that language specifically and they give you a live service game instead, I agree that should change. That language should change. You are not purchasing the game, you're not buying the game, you are paying to have a license to a live service experience. I get that. Is that what this is doing though? The initiative is not trying to call that out specifically. It's trying to say that all games need to stay in a functional, playable state, which is not calling out the language that is being used to manipulate the player. Call that out specifically, not this vague bull.
And finally, this is a diversion from really serious topics that politicians would prefer not to deal with.
That's really gross to me as well. The idea that this is just a diversion from serious topics and they can get an easy win in and we can just push it through and there won't be a lot of...
Oh, so sorry. The reason why I drew that whole...
He's also Ross, the original author. He's memeing here, I think. It's this is a joke and he just takes it seriously.
Whole thing in pain is because I think that Pirate Software is the master of trying to pretend that every single ask that you ever make of a software developer is actually infinitely complex, when in reality, no, you're just lazy.
Push back.
And there is a different scale that is kind of like this. It's the Dreyfus model of skill acquisition, where you start out as a novice and you are then an advanced beginner when you start building your skill and you need less hand holding. and it goes all the way up to being an expert, where I think expert level is usually when you're actually so competent and proficient that you can teach other people. And most developers are stuck somewhere in between here. It's a classic meme that people are stuck being high-level advanced beginners, where you don't really you have the perception. So we are like here in perception, where you have the perception of complexity. But what you're really doing is just stringing libraries and services together, and that's all you have. And once one of these things fail, you are now in uncharted territory that you can't deal with because you are not really competent or proficient, let alone being an expert. And I don't have any opinion on where Pirate Software falls into this, but the way he argues would, for me, also pattern match on being somewhere between these, which can happen. I mean, people can build careers on top of this, and they can get surprising amounts of stuff done and out into the world, which is another problem in and of itself.
On it, and or they're not going to have to think about it too hard. That's crazy dangerous, dude. If you're going to be setting precedent, if you're going to be putting forward something that you want to start a conversation to eventually become legislation, and these are the reasons for it, not only can I not...
And even this type of thinking, I think, is advanced beginner coded, where it's like you would much rather think about what all the problems are, because once you get into this area up here, you have a functional work loop where you take problems, you break them down, you make them solvable, and you just do them. I mean, maybe the difference between proficient and expert is that at some point you actually develop a taste for what problems you want to solve, or what problems you know that need to be solved, and what problems you can just leave alone. And a lot of this stuff down here, like the 5 trillion NPM dependencies and all your microservices stack, that is unmanageable if one node fails in here. That's a problem that you don't want to have in the first place. So if you, by just removing that problem space, you gain a lot of headroom.
I agree with the initiative, but I can't agree with you. And I think that the tactics that you're using here are really disgusting. So yes.
But regardless,
also pulling it onto like this social level is a classic thing that is definitely not part of an engineer mindset. So that shouldn't enter into any of this. He does it for the law angle, but I can see people doing this on the tech level as well.
if it'd be possible, I should still have the right to completely shut down my game. Should you? I don't know. That feels weird. Or I feel like at that point, it should be made upfront more clear to the customer, like what exactly you're buying. And it shouldn't even be called buying. That word should be banned. It should be called renting. You're paying $60 to rent this game until the person decides to revoke your access to it, all right?
I won't agree with that, and I won't agree with Ross. There's no way around that. I think this is gross. To sum it all up, no, I will not be supporting the initiative Stop Killing Games. You're not going to change my mind on it because I find this language to be incredibly vague and damaging to the rest of our industry. I think that it would be bad for both developers and players down the line in the way that it is currently written. And I think that starting a conversation that doesn't get to the core of the issue is both wasted time and leads to potentially bad outcomes. So if we want to talk about this, let's talk about the actual bad business practices. In the case that a studio is making a live service game and they sell it to you as a product, they say that you're purchasing the game.
I think he's kind of restating what this is actually about and trying to make it his own. But
or buying the game, when in reality you're actually purchasing or buying a license to that game. I think that we should be fighting about that. That needs to go away. A player should be well informed at the point of purchase that they are purchasing a license, not buying a game. And the reason that we have those licenses in the case of client-server interactions like we had before, we're talking about client-server games, is so that they can ban you when you cheat at them. They revoke your license. That's why they revoke your license, to protect the gameplay of every other player that you're impacting when you cheat at these games. That needs...
Okay, you might have a gap in your understanding of game engines. If you take your game that uses UE5 and try to replace that, it would take anywhere between 3 to 4 years with a sizable team. I work on game engines for a living. Well, I don't know what you're talking about when you say that. You think that you guys could build from nothing a custom game engine that would have the same feature set or capabilities as Unreal Engine 5? You think you could do that with a team of devs in 3 to 4 years? It takes people more time to build games on existing engines than I don't... What do you realize you're getting baited? Okay, true. Just kidding.
It's to exist, but it needs to be better informed to the player at time of purchase. So I agree on that. This doesn't bring that up, though. It just attacks all video games that have online-only components and says that they need to
doesn't,
keep
though.
being able to be played indefinitely. That doesn't make any sense to me. Aside from that, a lot of people really like live service games as they exist now. So trying to kill off all live service games is some people get married in them. Some people met their spouse in them and then got married in them. It's a really cool thing for a point in time in which you're having that social experience. And to destroy that just
He's saying swap it with another engine. Yeah, sure, but like, listen, I'm not even to the limits of my knowledge. I'm way out beyond any of my knowledge on Enos. My guess is going to be swapping from one engine to another. It probably super depends on what you're using that engine for. For instance, when it comes to graphics,
It also super depends on how well you were structured. So the entire problem is completely separate from the engine question. If you have your assets set up in a way, and if you have your game logic set up in a way that it can easily be pulled somewhere else, then the game engine kind of shouldn't matter. But people don't program in programming languages anymore. They program in frameworks and engines, and there is an entire class of programmers who really can't build stuff in just the bare bones standard library programming language anymore.
there might be things that UE5 does that other engines do comparably, and swapping from one to another might literally be as easy as just like moving textures to a different environment and just clicking run, and it basically works. And there might be some things that the UE5 engine does that are very specific to the UE5 engine that are either unduplicatable in other engines, or require a totally different implementation, or require a totally different workaround in order to get it to work, such that like there might be two games that might appear kind of similar, and one would take a fuck ton of work to transfer engines because it's relying on stuff that UE5 does really well, exceptionally well. And keep in mind too, you're not just creating a program that works when you're talking about games, you're creating a program that works, where working is qualified as like can run live, right? So it might be that UE5 does something a lot more efficiently as well, and doing it on another engine might still do the same thing, but now it's like way less efficient, and now you've got to like cut from other areas. I don't know, to transferring from one engine to another. I don't even know if you could ever extrapolate that. But I don't know. I don't have an idea. But I feel like
it really depends on the case, I think, and it depends on where you are in the development, and it super depends on what people you have. So if you are like a game studio that is comprised mostly of this class of people, then you would have an issue. And if you have mostly these people, then usually it's not a big deal. And usually everything that you have done so far is set up in a way that it might be easier to transfer over somewhere else.
it's probably not the case. Like it would probably depend on. It would probably depend on why you're using that particular engine, what features you're using from it, and then how unique that feature set is to that particular environment versus another. Would be my guess. Hey, Steve, I just want to say thank you. I'm graduating this fall.
So the reason why this is kind of interesting to me is because I'm trying to build a web engine in a way. I'm trying to not build a framework. I'm trying to build something that just does a job and does it well in the least amount of lines possible. Because going back to this image earlier, is this is the perception of how stuff works on the internet, where you have a browser and it gets stuff from a web server that has the data, and you just get it. It kind of works that way if you have entirely static data, which is why part of my system tries to make as much of the stuff that you request be as static as possible. I mean, assets are like the easiest case to solve. It's just like images or basic text files. That's simple. But as soon as you have some form of dynamic data, then it gets harder to do. And that's where you start. I mean, the first step that you usually have then is you want to have like a database in there somewhere that deals with the data. But in most frameworks, you also get like this portion of the thing, where what happens on the web server suddenly becomes incredibly complicated. It's not just like an HTML file that you download. It's a controller that pulls data through a model and through an object relation. I always forget what this is. It's a database interaction API, basically. So it pulls data from here and presents that in a view after putting the data through a controller, and that results in an HTML file. But the problem with all this is that it's incredibly slow, which is why most times what you find is that you end up with a caching server in front of this. And I've seen setups like this where this entire stack here, like having an e-commerce shop where you look at a product page, building that product page from the database or from the data in the database using the template logic and so forth can take seconds, which is entirely unacceptable for something so simple. So what they do is they have multiple web servers, and I saw this where they had like 2 web servers, and then in front of that they had 4 caching servers that would do nothing but request the latest copy of all this. And it's the other old saying that there are only 2 hard problems in computer science: cache invalidation and naming things, and off-by-one errors. But cache invalidation is a crucial thing that you need to get right, and it's about when do I know that the data has changed, because all the complex stuff that you do on top of the data only needs to be done if the data does change. And this is like the old way of doing web, where you have all this on the server side and you just put caching in front of it so that it kind of is acceptable in its speed. But even just in this stack, you could find millions of lines of code. And the typical framework is like 500,000 lines of code, and then you add like a company stack on top of that. You end up between 1 million and 1.5 million lines of code just for this stack here. So that's adding on top of the 50 million lines again. And the funniest thing I once saw is I saw this setup with 2 web servers and 4 caching servers, dealing out product pages that rely on data, and the data changed when there was a warehouse update from a different database, and that warehouse database happened once a night. So 4 caching servers were requesting in 50-minute intervals data from, or content from a web server that went through all this all the way down to the database for data that changed once every night. And all this work that is done and redone and redone and redone is entirely unnecessary unless anything changes down here. And to solve all this, the web people came up with a different approach where you kind of make the server side less complicated. So you might still have, obviously still have a web server, but it might just have like a few static files and like a GraphQL database. And then you get this entire stack and put it in the browser, which obviously decreases the computational load. It's just that now every single browser has to do the whole thing. And like all the React single page applications or Angular, they use, this is MVC, and then there's like model view, view model, and all these fancy ways of just dealing with how data gets into a template that gets to the browser. And my approach to all this is that this here is just, all of this is so complicated because we didn't get this one thing right. We didn't properly solve cache validation. And the reason is because we have built on top of the request model where browser sends something down here and gets back up. But if you just flip that around, if you say, I know what the result should be that lands in the caching server, and it only changes if I have a change in the data or in the templates, then you can derive a very simple dependency graph from that results in a static output that you can cache in memory, and that's basically it. But so that's kind of the approach that I'm taking. And so just to close that off, because I do want to get some work done today. I'm trying to build this sort of engine. I'm in my third iteration. Oh yeah, this was also a thing I forgot, because one of the other things that you usually have, and is kind of similar to Conway's law, is one of the other ironclad laws that you can find in this book, and that's the second system effect, where you start out with a code base and at some point it just grows and grows and you can't really deal with it anymore. And then engineers have the brilliant idea, we just need to build a new system. And that pretty much always fails in exactly the same way, where you end up with an over-complex system that does 80% of what you had before, and it does that poorly. And it's much slower, and it's a much worse experience for the end user, usually. And stuff like UE5 is good to the extent that they are actually maintaining a first system through the ages, and they probably had at some point a second system moment that they had to grow past. So I had a similar thing. I built a 1.0 of this, and the basis of all this was the flipping of this stack. So I started out using actual GNU Make to take data and templates and render out a static result that the web server can just deal out. So it kind of was like this here, and everything down here would always be pre-rendered when the data changes. So in 1.0 it was entirely static. You just press make and the result would be static HTML files that just work. And then I extended, so that was the second system, I extended that concept with being able to change the data, and I ran into the second system effect where it got overly complicated. So right now I'm building the third version of that, where I'm just deleting a lot of code and making things a lot more simple. I'm doing it kind of publicly, but there is no GitHub repository. I do it alone, partially to not run into Conway's law, but also because I can still fit everything I need to accomplish in my own head. And I think it serves the complexity of the system to have it stay that way for as long as possible. And 1.0 was like 7 years ago, 2.0 was like 3 years ago or 2 years ago. And I want to finish 3.0 this year. So this will be what I'm going to do in the next few months, is finishing the system and building 2 projects with that. And for that, I just get up every day and work on it. But the underlying assumption is that the web really is mostly text, or the stuff that is not static assets that you just pull in is just text, and text is embarrassingly simple. And that might actually be the reason why people make it so complicated. It's partially also Conway's law usually, and people don't see the forest for the trees, and they just assume that all this microservice structure that you grew into is actually necessary to do all this, but it's really not. And the one crucial thing to get right, as I said up here, is if you get cache invalidation right, then that automatically decreases your complexity, I don't know, by 10x or 100x. And from the pure code base, so I said that usually code bases are around 1 million or 1.5 million lines of code. And currently the stack that I'm using is about 10,000 lines of code. and I might even get it down to 5,000, but I'm not quite sure yet. But the resulting, if you build a website with this that is reasonably complex, like an e-commerce shop, then you should land somewhere around 15k lines of code, and that's it. So that's the goal, and that is about 100x more simple than the traditional approaches. And that's all I have for show and tell for today. Yes, but I do this every morning. I get up and work for an hour or two before the actual work starts. And live streaming it helps me to stay on topic, which is why I do this. So let's get back to all this and close all these tabs. We don't need them.